But now we have a man-child, an ADHD, person off his meds who's just bouncing all over the place.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a world where the very foundations of global power are, well, shifting right beneath our feet, where you have leaders' personal ambitions kind of colliding with the complex realities of international security.
Yeah, that's a dangerous mix.
And where military might itself is constantly being reevaluated, maybe even redefined, in the brutal crucible of the battlefield.
It's definitely a landscape of precarious balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every decision, every little misstep, it feels like it can just echo across continents.
With profound consequences, absolutely.
And what's truly compelling here, I think, is how these events that seem completely separate,
right,
like, the clandestine progress of nuclear programs in the Middle East, or these heated debates about military spending in Europe.
Yeah, the NATO stuff.
Exactly. Or even the real-time, often reactive adaptations happening on the ground in Ukraine. They're all intricately interwoven. They really are.
So it's not just isolated incidents.
Not at all. They paint this complex, almost urgent picture of a changing world order. And they fundamentally challenge those traditional ideas of strategic dominance. So this deep dive, we're really going to try and illuminate those intricate connections, show how the global stage is being, dramatically reshaped right now, right before our eyes.
And we've got quite a stack of sources to help us do that today. Really insightful stuff, ranging from detailed threat assessment briefs, military analyses.
Yeah, some deep technical stuff in there.
Definitely. But also frank discussions on alliance stability and even public commentary that gives you this fascinating window into the often unpredictable human side of geopolitics.
The personality factor, it matters.
It really does. So our mission here is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from all this material, help you understand how this potent mix of leadership decisions, big geopolitical strategies, and these rapid-fire military developments, how they're actively altering the global balance of power.
Yeah, and we'll be looking closely at how pursuing individual goals.
Like what, for example?
Well, maybe the perceived chance for a Nobel Peace Prize, or that long-standing, almost ideological desire for regime change somewhere.
Ah, okay.
How that can inadvertently expose really significant weaknesses in traditional power structures.
And maybe even more critically.
Exactly. It can provide invaluable, often painful intelligence to adversaries, fundamentally changing the strategic playing field for everyone involved.
Right, let's kick off our deep dive then. Let's examine what our sources are highlighting as a particularly maybe reckless gambit with global implications, this volatile Iran-Israel nexus.
Always a flashpoint.
Always. And this relationship, it's perpetually fraught with tension. So to really understand where things are now, I think we need to start by tracing Iran's nuclear ambitions and, crucially, how international oversight, or maybe the lack of it, has evolved.
Yeah, that context is key. And it's important to remember, connecting this to the bigger picture, Iran's nuclear program wasn't always seen with the kind of intense apprehension we have today. Oh yeah, it actually started way back under the Shah in the 1950s. And perhaps surprisingly to many now, it was actively promoted by the United States back then.
Huh, I didn't realize that.
It's true. The real shift towards, greater concern, that happened in the first decade after the Islamic Republic was established, post-1979 revolution.
Okay.
It was then that the clerical government clearly set the goal of achieving a full nuclear fuel cycle.
Which could be civilian or military.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But critically, they pursued this by hiding key parts: uranium conversion, enrichment, even nuclear weapons design efforts. They hid these from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the wider world.
So deliberately covert from early on.
Deliberately covert.
Okay.
And that really laid the foundation for so much of the profound distrust that defines the situation today.
Which brings us to a really pivotal moment, didn't it? That shaped the current trajectory. These covert enrichment efforts, they got exposed, right?
They did. Dramatically exposed by an Iranian opposition group back in 2002.
Yeah.
It was a huge intelligence coup at the time.
And what did the U.S. intelligence community make of it?
Well, what's crucial to grasp is their subsequent assessment. They later confirmed Iran had engaged in prior weaponization efforts.
Ah, so they confirmed the weapons link.
They confirmed past efforts, yes, judging them inherently contrary to the spirit and letter of Iran's NPT obligations. That's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right.
However, and this is key, in a major national intelligence estimate, an NIE, from 2007, They judged with high confidence that Iran's actual weaponization program had halted in the fall of 2003.
Halted. So they stopped trying to build a bomb.
The assessment was the dedicated, coordinated program stopped. And that judgment remained consistent even in later testimony from top intelligence officials like the DNI and DIA director. So while past efforts and a clear intent were acknowledged,
The direct weaponization part was assessed to have ceased.
correct. But, and this is the crucial bit, the option to develop nuclear weapons remained very much alive. That was the persistent concern. They kept the door open.
Which leads us right to the present day and this critical question about international oversight. What's the state of the IAEA's ability to actually monitor Iran's program now?
Well, the sources, frankly, paint a deeply concerning picture. The IAEA's ability to effectively monitor what is now a complex and rapidly growing nuclear program. It's been significantly reduced.
How so? What happened?
A major factor is Iran's refusal, this started in 2023, to allow the designation of experienced inspectors to replace those whose clearances they withdrew.
So they're kicking out the experienced inspector.
Or refusing replacements, yeah. This action alone has considerably degraded the agency's capacity for effective verification and monitoring on the ground.
Wow.
And the degradation is so severe, it raises serious concerns about what they call unresolved nuclear weapons dimensions.
Meaning what, exactly? Lingering questions.
Precisely. Questions about past activities, possibly related to weapons development, that haven't been adequately answered. And, more broadly, it casts doubt on the IAEA's actual capacity to detect any potential diversion of nuclear materials to undeclared facilities.
So basically, the international community is flying partially blind.
That's a fair way to put it. Operating with a much cloudier and therefore a much more dangerous view of Iran's nuclear activities.
And the practical implications of that, reduced oversight, combined with Iran's progress, the numbers must be pretty stark.
They are stark. According to one assessment we looked at, if Iran were to make that strategic decision to break out,
Meaning, go for the bomb.
go for weapons-grade uranium, yes, they could produce enough for their first nuclear weapon in potentially just a matter of days.
Days, not weeks or months.
Potentially days for the first one, based on certain scenarios in the assessment. And the timelines get even more alarming when you consider their existing stockpiles of enriched uranium.
Okay, lay it out for us.
If they use their current stockpile of 60% highly enriched uranium, the HEU, they could produce enough for 7 nuclear weapons in just over 3 weeks.
7 bombs in 3 weeks.
Roughly, yes. And if they also leverage their 20% enriched uranium and the full centrifuge capacity at their Natanz facility, they could potentially have enough for 10 nuclear weapons within the first month of breakout.
10 within a month.
And potentially wreaking enough weapons-grade uranium for 17 weapons by the end of the 4th month.
17, that's a terrifying escalation potential.
It is. These aren't just hypothetical figures. They represent a very real and significantly shortened timeline for Iran. It creates extreme danger for regional stability, global non-proliferation. It fundamentally shifts the calculus for neighbors like Israel and Saudi Arabia.
You can see how that would accelerate talk of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
Makes it a far more immediate threat, absolutely.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly, but stay within this volatile context. Our source material uses some pretty strong language, referring explicitly to the U.S.-Israeli fantasy of regime change in Iran as a key driver here.
Yes, that phrase stands out. It highlights this persistent, almost ideological belief within some Western factions that, imposing a new government on Iran is a viable strategic fix.
A fantasy, though. Why that word?
Well, the implication is it's a belief held despite the, frankly, brutal lessons of recent history from similar interventions. It's presented less as a calculated policy and more as a deeply ingrained, perhaps self-deceiving notion.
And one that often ignores the internal dynamics within Iran itself.
Precisely. That's a crucial point. What's often overlooked in this fantasy is the actual sentiment inside Iran, which ironically directly contradicts the idea that foreign-imposed change would work.
How so? What do the sources say about Iranian public opinion?
According to our sources, nearly everyone inside Iran, outside of the most entrenched hardliner faction, actually supports either sweeping reform or even a full change in government. There is demonstrable discontent with the status quo.
Okay, so they want change.
But, and this is the critical nuance hammered home in the material, They also overwhelmingly agree they absolutely do not want that change imposed by foreign powers. Not by bombs, not by invasions, and definitely not by exiled figures trying to ride in on foreign tanks, so to speak.
That's a really important distinction, this resistance to external interference.
It's deeply ingrained, born from historical experience, and it's a huge factor, often misjudged or just ignored in Western policy circles. It undermines any externally driven regime change effort right from the start.
Which naturally leads us to look at specific figures who position themselves as external opposition leaders, like Reza Pahlavi. How do the sources portray him?
Quite bluntly, actually. Described as a relic of a bygone era with a shrinking, disconnected base. Remember, he left Iran as a teenager.
Right.
And his public actions are often characterized, in the sources, by a history of missteps, contradictions, and political insensitivity.
Like what specifically?
Well, his high-profile trip to Israel to meet Benjamin Netanyahu, that's mentioned, and especially his public applause for Israeli actions during periods of escalating violence. These are explicitly cited as acts of betrayal by many Iranians.
Wow, betrayal. That's strong.
It is, and the comparison drawn is pretty stark. He looks more like Ahmad Chalabi than George Washington.
Oof. Chalabi, the Iraqi politician who pushed for the U.S. invasion from outside.
Exactly. A figure largely discredited after the chaos that followed in Iraq. So that comparison paints Pahlavi as potentially leading Iran down a similar disastrous path in the view of these sources.
And this perception just further undermines any foreign-backed regime change idea, making it politically toxic inside Iran.
Absolutely. It kills the legitimacy.
So what's the bottom line here? What does this all mean for the bigger picture, the effectiveness of these kinds of interventions?
The sources are just unequivocally clear on this. The last 2 decades have taught a brutal lesson. Foreign-imposed regime change simply does not create compliant allies. That's often the stated goal, right?
Yeah, install a friendly government.
But it doesn't work out that way. Instead, it consistently creates vacuums filled by extremists, proxy wars, and humanitarian catastrophes.
And they cite examples.
Oh yes. Post-Saddam, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. Painful, undeniable examples of this failed strategy.
Chaos in Iraq, civil war in Libya, horrific crisis in Yemen.
Exactly. Power vacuums leading to sectarian violence, ISIS in Iraq. Libya plunged into protracted civil war after Gaddafi. Yemen, foreign intervention just exacerbated a terrible humanitarian crisis, leading to one of the world's worst proxy conflicts.
And this brutal lesson, it's starting to sink in somewhere.
It seems so, particularly in the region itself. This is precisely why Arab Gulf states, who once aligned very closely with the U.S. against Iran, are now pragmatically pivoting towards diplomacy with Iran.
Interesting. So former rivals are talking?
They are. They've seen the devastating realities firsthand. And it stands in stark contrast to that persistent fantasy held in some Western policy circles. They're choosing pragmatism over ideology, it seems.
Okay, this whole complex backdrop really sets the stage for the recent direct conflict between Iran and Israel, doesn't it? Late 2024. You said it was like a laboratory exchange.
In a way, yes. A very telling, almost controlled experiment that revealed significant insights into military capabilities and, maybe more importantly, the very nature of strategic dominance, or perhaps the loss of it.
Right. So walk us through that escalation. What happened in late October 2024?
Well, things kicked off, according to the sources, after an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon killed senior Hezbollah members, including Hassan Nasrallah. That combined with Israeli ground operations starting in Lebanon earlier, around October 1st.
Okay, so Israel initiated actions in Lebanon.
Correct. And then in direct retaliation for those actions, Iran launched a massive, unprecedented attack on October 1st. They deployed over 180 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles towards Israel.
Over 180 projectiles. That's huge.
It was a substantial, coordinated strike. A direct escalation we hadn't really seen before between these two specific adversaries.
But how effective was it? Did they hit much?
Well, crucially, most of those projectiles were actually intercepted. Israeli, U.S., and other allied air and ground-based defenses. They successfully neutralized the vast majority of the incoming threats.
So the defenses held up. Iron Dome, David's Sling.
Those, plus aero systems, even U.S. Patriot batteries were involved. A multi-layered defense. The sources note only minor damage and casualties occurred. Several missiles did hit the Israeli Nevatim air base, but apparently non-critical parts.
Okay, so Iran's massive attack was largely blunted.
The defensive response was highly effective in that initial exchange, yes. It prevented widespread devastation and showcased a pretty robust air defense capability.
But then came Israel's retaliation. That's where the deeper strategic message lies, you said.
Exactly. Israel's response on October 26 was different. It was a large-scale precision operation. Involved over 100 aircraft, including their advanced F-35 stealth fighters.
100 aircraft. What did they hit?
They hit Iranian S-300 missile defense batteries, a cornerstone of Iran's air defense network. They also hit missile component production facilities at the Parchin military complex.
Parchin. Isn't that linked to nuclear work?
It has been historically, yes. And critically, these strikes also hit an additional facility at Parchin, known as Taliban 2. And that site was specifically connected to Iran's past nuclear weaponization work back in the early 2000s.
Ah, okay. So this wasn't just tit for tat.
No, it was highly targeted. A revealing counterstrike designed to send a very clear message and maybe test this concept of escalatory dominance.
Escalatory dominance. The ability to always have a superior response.
Basically, yeah. To control the pace and intensity of the conflict because, you can always out-escalate your opponent. Israel seemed to be demonstrating they still had it.
What was the impact on Iran from these strikes?
Considerable and highly revealing from an intelligence viewpoint. The attack reportedly eliminated much of Iran's air defense capabilities, leaving Iran profoundly vulnerable to future aerial assaults.
Eliminated much of their air defense.
Wow, that's what the sources suggest. It demonstrated Israel's undeniable ability to deeply penetrate Iranian airspace with advanced precision missiles and destroy select buildings. Suggests a significant intelligence advantage, too.
And hitting that Taliban 2 site.
That was the chilling signal. It demonstrated Israel's precise capacity to detect, target, and destroy facilities that might be related to nuclear weaponization work, even hidden or historical ones.
So it provided real-time intel on both sides. Israeli capabilities, Iranian vulnerabilities.
Exactly. It essentially dismantled Iran's ability to defend itself from a sophisticated aerial assault in that moment and exposed a critical weakness in their strategic defenses, a very painful lesson for Tehran.
And the political fallout continued afterwards. I remember Donald Trump weighed in.
He did. After the immediate conflict died down, on June 25, 2025, Trump stated emphatically that the U.S. would not allow Iran to rebuild its uranium facilities.
Not allow them.
His words. And that he'd be willing to strike Iran again to prevent it. He even sort of used that maybe a nuclear deal like the old JCPOA wasn't even necessary anymore, given the damage inflicted.
That's a very aggressive unilateral stance. Big implications for non-proliferation.
Huge. Risks further destabilizing an already incredibly volatile region.
But despite Trump's comments, the actual diplomacy, that's still stuck.
Stubbornly in place, yes. Even with a planned meeting mentioned for the week of June 29th, the fundamental negotiating positions hadn't budged.
Still U.S. demanding zero enrichment, Iran insisting on its right to enrich.
That's the core impasse. But what's particularly insightful here from an intelligence angle in our sources is this report about intercepted communications within Iran.
Oh, what did they show?
They suggested that Iranian military officials actually delivered false situation reports to their own senior leaders, deliberately downplaying the true extent of the damage from the Israeli strikes.
Really? Lying to their own leadership?
That's the suggestion. And this is especially notable because leaked U.S. intelligence assessments apparently partly relied on signals, intelligence meaning intercepts, which suggests Western powers might have had a clearer picture of Iran's internal deception than Iran's own leadership did.
That's incredible. A huge vulnerability if your own military isn't giving you accurate information in a crisis.
A massive vulnerability. Could lead to terrible miscalculations, both internally and externally.
Okay, let's pivot now. From the specific tensions in the Middle East, let's look at the broader assessment of Western military strength. Or, maybe as you hinted, its erosion. The Iran-Israel conflict revealed some specific vulnerabilities, sure, but what about the overall picture? Alliances, readiness. Let's unpack the challenges facing NATO, especially under the unique influence of someone like Donald Trump.
Right. It's definitely a fact that Donald Trump was the first U.S. president to push NATO allies quite so stridently, so publicly, on defense spending.
Yeah, the 2% thing became his mantra.
It did. And more controversially, he openly questioned the fundamental U.S. commitment to Article 5.
The collective defense clause. An attack on one is an attack on all.
The bedrock of the alliance.
Yeah.
And questioning that, well, this unique and intense pressure, it really has provoked mixed reactions.
How so?
Well, some, both in the US and within NATO, see it as a necessary kickstart. They argue it actually strengthened the alliance by forcing members to take commitments more seriously, increase contributions.
A tough love argument.
Kind of. But others worry profoundly that he's inadvertently, or maybe even intentionally, laying the groundwork to pull back from NATO or even exit altogether.
Which would be catastrophic for European security.
Devastating.
Yeah.
Especially for frontline states bordering Russia, Poland, the Baltics. They have the most to lose from any hint of U.S. abandonment, particularly since they've consistently contributed to NATO missions, hoping for that Article 5 reciprocity.
So this brings us to those spending targets. What exactly are they, and how significant are they really? The 2%.
Right, the 2% of GDP on defense, that's been a long-standing goal, reaffirmed back in 2014 after Russia's first Ukraine incursion. But our sources reveal there's now a new, more expansive, informal goal emerging. 5%.
5%. That's a huge jump.
It is, and it's split. 3.5% for core defense troops, equipment, readiness for actual battle.
Okay.
And then an additional 1.5% for broader whole-of-society resilience.
What does that entail?
It's less strictly defined, but includes critical stuff like cybersecurity, military mobility, things like upgrading bridges and roads so tanks and troops can move quickly, and even civil defense preparedness for the population.
Interesting. But is that 2% figure itself really the magic number?
Well, many analysts agree it's not some critical make-or-break threshold in purely military terms. It's become more of a political target, a symbol of burden sharing. Even the U.S., spending around 3.4% of its GDP on defense, allocates only a relatively small slice of that directly to NATO goals or European security specifically. The U.S. budget covers global commitments.
And the politics around Trump's influence, how is that playing out within the alliance?
Oh, the sources paint a pretty vivid picture. A clear and sometimes uncomfortable effort to manage his influence and rhetoric. Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General.
Yeah.
He's explicitly described in some material as engaging in sweet-talking Trump, even making a grotesque gesture, that's the phrase used to soothe Trump's narcissism and prevent a potential U.S. pullback.
Wow, grotesque gesture, narcissism. This is strong language from diplomatic sources.
It reflects a perception reported in the sources, yeah. Our perception of him treating global diplomacy like reality TV, potentially prioritizing personal ego. Rutte himself has had to publicly state that boosting defense spending means, quote, spending less on other priorities, like pensions and Social Security.
Direct trade-off.
A direct trade-off, acknowledged publicly.
Yeah.
Described by some commentators as a kind of humiliation, really. It underscores the immense internal pressures and difficult choices NATO members face, trying to placate a potentially unpredictable U.S. leader.
Which brings us to this critical distinction now being made. Is NATO ready for war? Like immediate conflict versus being ready for protracted war, a long slog.
Exactly, that's the key question. And the sources indicate NATO has made significant strides recently. Integrating Finland and Sweden was huge.
That had a lot of capability in the north.
Considerable air, naval, land combat power, yeah. Removed any doubt about their role in an Article 5 scenario. Plus, they've implemented this new NATO force model, the NFM.
What does that do?
It aims for a much faster deployment and a 10-fold increase in high-readiness national forces, basically ensuring the alliance can fight tonight, as they say.
So, immediate readiness is improving.
It seems so. But the question, as articulated by commanders like CR, General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, remains. Is NATO ready for a protracted war?
Which requires
Far more than just rapid deployment. It demands deep industrial capacity, robust supply chains that can sustain a long, high-intensity fight, huge magazine depth.
meaning stockpiles of ammo, parts.
Exactly. Logistics, mass, sheer numbers of troops and equipment. And crucially, the will to fight across entire populations, sustaining support for a long, costly war.
And those areas still lagging.
Those are areas where significant challenges and halting progress persist, according to the sources. It suggests the potential long-term vulnerability, even with the improvements in immediate readiness.
While NATO grapples with these big alliance issues, let's look at specific European countries trying to rearm. Germany's struggle seems like a really stark case study.
It is a very illuminating example of the difficulties involved.
After Russia's full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Chancellor Scholz announced this Zeitenwende, a turning point. Big moment.
Huge. He pledged to finally hit the 2% NATO spending target and set up that massive 100 billion euros special fund to modernize the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces.
A monumental shift for Germany, given its history.
Absolutely. Widely hailed as revolutionary, recognizing the new geopolitical reality.
But has the reality matched the rhetoric nearly 2 years later?
The reality on the ground for Germany's military remains pretty sobering. According to Parliament's own commissioner for the armed forces, Germany still has too little of everything.
Still, despite the 100 billion euros.
Despite the money. What's insightful here is how slowly that significant financial commitment is translating into actual, tangible military readiness and capability.
Why is it so slow? What's the bottleneck?
It seems the underlying issue isn't just lack of funds anymore. It's deeply entrenched bureaucracy, a fragmented defense industry that wasn't geared up for mass production, and just years and years of post-Cold War demobilization that eroded industrial capacity.
So the system itself wasn't ready for the money.
Basically, yes. Deep systemic inertia. The military state hasn't fundamentally transformed in the urgent way many expected, despite the political will and the cash infusion.
So what does this mean in practical terms for actually getting new tanks, new planes?
The buildup of key systems is painfully, almost comically slow. Our sources highlight this sobering thought experiment. At the current procurement pace, Germany wouldn't replenish its artillery howitzers just back to the levels they had in 2004 until the year 2121.
2121? That can't be right.
That's the projection based on current rates in this thought experiment. Main battle tanks back to 2004 levels by 2066. Infantry fighting vehicles by 2043. Even combat aircraft, despite a major F-35 order, wouldn't be fully replenished until 2038.
Those timelines are staggering. It exposes a massive problem with industrial capacity and procurement, doesn't it?
A deep-seated issue, yeah. Inefficient processes, lack of urgency. It shows how decades of underinvestment created this chasm that even a huge fund struggles to bridge quickly, especially when you compare it to the speed needed for modern high-intensity conflict.
And you're saying this isn't just a German problem?
No, it's critical to understand that. While Germany's situation might be particularly pronounced because of its history, other major European powers, the UK, France, Italy, they also saw significant sustained cuts in military spending for years.
When was this?
Leading up to the 2008 financial crisis and beyond. Even as the US was actually increasing its defense budget significantly during much of that period, Europe generally cashed in on a perceived peace dividend after the Cold War.
So everyone sort of let their guard down?
To varying degrees, yes. This collective trend contributed to that broader picture of declining Western military superiority. It highlights the long, hard road ahead for reestablishing robust defense capabilities across the continent. It's a deep, long-term strategic deficit we're seeing.
And the war in Ukraine, it's like this live battlefield laboratory, isn't it? Exposing the realities of modern industrial warfare in real time.
Absolutely. It's where all the theories about military strength and adaptation are being brutally tested moment by moment, offering profound lessons for everyone.
What are we seeing emerge from Ukraine's side?
Well, an unexpected narrative, really. Despite being the defender, Ukraine has largely retained the initiative in many ways. And crucially, it's emerging as a genuine drone warfare superpower.
A drone superpower? How?
It owes a lot to the country's strong tech traditions, this real entrepreneurial spirit, and just the urgent necessity to innovate when facing a larger aggressor. Ukrainian drone developers have been remarkably agile.
Better than imported drones.
That's the claim in the sources. Ukrainian drones are now considered leagues ahead of many foreign models. One commander apparently said, "Foreign models are like Toyotas now, while Ukrainian drones are Mercedes."
High praise.
And this innovative spirit, this rapid domestic development, it's also translating into formidable long-range attack capabilities. They're developing domestically produced cruise missiles now.
Meaning they can strike deeper into Russia.
Exactly, extending their reach, complicating Russia's operational planning significantly.
And Russia. They stumbled badly at the start, but the sources say they've adapted.
They have demonstrably adapted, yes. Though it's important to note, much of this adaptation seems reactive, aimed at fixing the serious deficiencies exposed early on in 2022.
How have they adapted tactically?
They've shifted away somewhat from relying purely on highly mechanized forces towards more infantry-centric formations.
Like what?
Things like these assault groups and the notorious Storm Z detachments. These tactics seem heavily influenced by the Wagner Group's brutal, attritional approach.
Storm Z. Those are the penal battalions, right?
Often composed of recruited prisoners, yes. Designed for attritional assault infantry roles, basically prioritizing sheer numbers and pressure over sophisticated maneuver.
And other adaptations. Air defense.
Yes. They've seen significant increases in air defense effectiveness, particularly around static, high-value locations. Point defenses are now better connected to superior radar systems, improving their ability to intercept threats like guided rockets.
This leads to this idea of the transparent battlefield we hear about. What does that mean?
It means both sides are incredibly reliant on drones for basically everything. Reconnaissance, targeting, direct attack, concealment is almost impossible.
So everyone sees everyone all the time.
Pretty much. Russian forces in particular are using a significant number of drones, including these fiber optic controlled drones.
Fiber optic, how does that help?
The wired connection makes them very difficult to jam with electronic warfare. Big advantage. They're also using lots of FPV first-person view drones for ambush tactics against infantry and equipment, real-time, cheap precision strikes, and even things like Molnia drones for carrying payloads.
So this constant surveillance changes everything tactically.
Fundamentally, forces have to disperse more, making command and control harder. And it often leads to higher casualties because you're always potentially being watched and targeted.
And connecting this back to the bigger picture, you said Ukraine is an attritional industrial war.
Yes, that's key. Victory is ultimately determined by the ability to generate and sustain forces. It directly links military success to a nation's industrial production rates and its capacity for long-term sustainment, replacing losses, supplying ammo, fuel.
And Russia has the advantage there.
Critically, yes. Russia is leveraging its massive population advantage and its ability to mobilize its defense industry, partly thanks to state control, to try and exhaust Ukraine's ability to field forces.
And Ukraine is feeling that pressure.
Our sources highlight that Ukraine is facing a major infantry manpower crisis. Struggling to recruit enough people, struggling to maintain a deep defense line. There are real concerns about its ability to sustain its forces against Russia's numerical superiority and its capacity to just absorb horrific casualties.
It really underscores the brutal math of industrial warfare.
It does. The deep challenges faced by any nation in a large-scale conflict without a massive industrial base and a significant demographic advantage are starkly clear.
Right, let's broaden our gaze again. Beyond the immediate battlefields, let's look at the ascent of rivals and this ongoing erosion of traditional Western dominance. While Ukraine is a microcosm, nations like Russia and China are demonstrating strategic gains that are reshaping the whole global balance of power.
Absolutely. And looking at Russia, beyond the ground war adaptations, their military capabilities are showing strategic improvements elsewhere too, with long-term implications.
Like their air defenses, you mentioned improvement.
Yes, as we touched on, showing a significant increase in effectiveness. Point defenses, linked to better radar, are now reportedly intercepting things like GMLRS strikes.
Those are the guided rockets the U.S. supplies.
Exactly. Guided multiple launch rocket system strikes. Highly accurate, long range. They were once considered nearly impossible to shoot down reliably. That's changing, it seems, at least around key points.
And Russian air power.
Still somewhat constrained, forced into standoff attacks rather than dominating the airspace. But they possess a large stockpile of these FAB-500 glide bombs.
Glide bombs.
Basically large, older, unguided bombs fitted with wings and basic guidance kits to give them extended range. They lack precision, but their sheer destructive power, when used in volume, poses a serious threat. It shows Russia's capacity for reactive adaptation and improvement, even under wartime pressure. Suggests a more formidable opponent going forward.
And what about the long-term implications of Russia's defense production surge?
That's particularly insightful. This rapid increase in industrial output since 2022. It's projected to result in a larger, better equipped, and importantly more experienced post-war Russian military.
So not just for the current war, but a future threat.
A future more formidable Russia projecting power more effectively. And critically, this production surge will also likely lead to an increased flow of military exports.
Selling more weapons abroad.
Yes, particularly to regimes unfriendly to the West, especially in the global South, as the sources put it. The material points to the Red Sea crisis with the Houthis as a kind of warning sign. It demonstrates the significant impact when hostile non-state actors, or smaller states, acquire substantial arsenals, drones, anti-ship missiles that were once the preserve of powerful states. It creates new regional challenges and actively erodes traditional Western technological advantages in unexpected, asymmetric ways.
This leads us to global stability issues, like nuclear arms control. The New START treaty is expiring soon.
It is, February 2026, and its impending expiration poses a significant concern. It's the last major nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, limiting deployed strategic warheads and delivery systems.
And Russia's already violating it.
Russia is assessed to be in violation, yes, refusing inspections, for example. However, analysts cited suggest there's probably little strategic advantage for the U.S. to just unilaterally withdraw right now.
Why not?
Because actually increasing the U.S. arsenal significantly would still take considerable time and money, likely pushing any major expansion beyond the treaty's expiration date anyway.
So pulling out doesn't gain much immediately.
Arguably not. Nonetheless, there's a strong argument presented that the U.S. still has a moral imperative to lead on nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, even if expectations for sweeping new agreements have to be set pretty low, given the current geopolitical climate and the deep distrust.
Okay, let's shift to the other major player profoundly transforming the landscape, especially in places like the Middle East: China.
Yes, China's increased activity across the Middle East has the potential to be truly transformational.
Why transformational?
Well, just look at Beijing's immense economic resources, coupled with its rapidly advancing military capabilities across all domains: cyber, space, conventional forces. There's growing speculation, as the U.S. maybe reduces its focus or presence there.
Pivots to Asia, maybe.
Exactly, that China could step into the role of a regional stabilizer. A significant shift from the traditional dynamic where the U.S. was seen as the primary security guarantor for decades.
A power vacuum China might fill.
That's the speculation, yeah. And it's gained urgency as U.S.-China relations have soured, suggesting China might see an opportunity to reshape regional alignments in its favor.
But what are China's true intentions there? Is it about supplanting the U.S. or just economics?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the signals are ambiguous. Some analysts portray a China determined to overtly push the U.S. out, dominate global governance, commerce, security. Others see primarily economic ambitions, with little real interest in directly challenging American military dominance in the Middle East.
And China's official policy isn't much help.
Not really. Their 2016 Arab policy paper is mentioned, but it offers little concrete insight. It's filled with broad platitudes about cooperation, partnership, nothing specific on strategic goals.
So analysts just project their own views onto China.
The sources suggest that happens a lot, yeah. Analysts graft their own biases, assumptions, and politics onto Beijing's approach, partly because China's own conceptions of military power, statecraft, how influence works, they differ fundamentally from Western norms. It makes it hard for outsiders to accurately read their long-term strategy without projecting.
Beyond the economic and diplomatic moves, are there more direct, maybe covert actions indicating China's ambitions?
Well, the sources highlight a couple of things. U.S. intelligence reports indicate both Russia and China are actively trying to recruit disgruntled federal employees in the U.S.
Classic espionage tactics.
A clear and persistent effort at intelligence gathering and infiltration, yeah. And then more overtly in the Indo-Pacific, you see China's increased drone activity triggering more frequent Japanese jet scrambles.
Testing responses.
Probing defenses, signaling presence.
Yeah.
And there was even a notable incident mentioned where a Chinese Y-9 spy plane, a military transport adapted for intelligence gathering, actually violated Japanese airspace.
That's a direct violation.
Yes. These actions underscore a calculated strategy: gather intelligence, probe defenses, assess the readiness and response capabilities of rivals, pushing the boundaries of what's considered normal in international airspace and waters.
Okay, let's try and bring all these threads together. The combined evidence from our sources, it seems to strongly suggest a major shift is underway. One source even talks about a regime change from a US-led world order to great power politics.
That's a powerful phrase. And it's not just rhetorical. It implies profound, tangible consequences for how the global economy is organized, how security works, how policy decisions get made everywhere.
Moving away from that unipolar moment after the Cold War.
Towards a more multipolar, definitely more competitive international order, major powers vying for influence, resources, potentially leading to increased instability, shifting alliances. It's a messier, less predictable world.
Which raises a really critical, maybe unsettling question. Can the US actually manage multiple major threats or conflicts simultaneously anymore?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? A senior European diplomat is quoted, acknowledging this shifting landscape, particularly with recent U.S. rhetoric.
What did they say?
Voiced concerns that China's rise, quote, could have an impact on the military role the U.S. would be able to play in helping to protect Europe. Stated quite bluntly, there may not be enough capacity for two theaters.
Two theaters, meaning, say, a fight in the Indo-Pacific and supporting Europe against Russia.
Exactly. That's the implied dilemma. Prioritizing one region might mean deprioritizing another. It fundamentally limits the U.S. ability to project power globally in the way it once could. It's a clear sign of capacity constraints, challenging those old assumptions of U.S. strategic omnipotence.
So what's the final verdict here? What does this all mean for the West and its long-held position of superiority?
Well, the combined evidence strongly suggests that traditional Western military superiority is being fundamentally challenged, maybe even actively eroded. You have adversaries like Russia and Iran demonstrably adapting, improving capabilities, posing increasingly significant, sophisticated threats. They're learning, reacting.
Well, the West.
Meanwhile, established Western powers are grappling with deep internal divisions, political polarization affecting long-term strategy. They're facing protracted rearmament delays because of bureaucracy and industrial inertia, and they're confronting the immense financial and logistical costs of modern industrial-scale warfare, which Ukraine is highlighting daily.
So the era of unquestioned Western dominance, it's over.
The sources strongly imply it appears to be drawing to a close, replaced by more complex, more competitive, and certainly less predictable global military balance. Established power hierarchies are constantly being contested, redefined. And that brings us to a final crucial factor, one that's often underestimated in these big geopolitical analyses: the human element, specifically the profound and sometimes disruptive influence of individual leadership and, frankly, personal ego on the world stage.
Right. And our sources offer some pretty vivid, often critical descriptions, particularly regarding Donald Trump's perceived persona.
They do. He's described at times by sources cited, could be diplomats, commentators, as a huge narcissist.
Yeah.
Someone who treats global diplomacy like reality TV.
Strain words.
Very.
Yeah.
These characterizations highlight the emotional, unpredictable, highly personalized element he can bring to foreign policy. The implication, reading between the lines of some sources, is that such a leader might prioritize personal gratification.
Like the Nobel Peace Prize ambition mentioned earlier.
That's one potential example floated in some commentary, prioritizing something like that over carefully calculated strategic interests, and thereby inadvertently gambling with global security for personal ego.
And there's even discussion in the sources trying to frame these behaviors psychologically.
It's interesting, yeah. Some public discourse referenced attempts to understand these patterns. Our sources mention things like an article titled Recognizing Adult ADHD, What Donald Trump Can Teach Us, and a YouTube Q&A on coping with Trump testosterone and ADHD. Now, these discussions refer to things like perceived psychological attitudes being a free spirit anti-authoritarian, questioning stupid bedtime restrictions, experiencing anxiety or futility if not constantly acting.
It's crucial we state, though, these are external observations cited in the material, right?
Yeah.
Not a diagnosis.
Absolutely critical. We are not endorsing this perspective or making any diagnosis. It's simply reflecting attempts in public discourse, as captured by our sources, to contextualize a unique leadership style. The relevance here is how perceived impulsivity or a fragmented focus could impact the consistency and predictability needed for stable foreign policy.
Right, which leads to the practicalities. How does this style, or any leader style really, affect actually governing and executing policy?
Well, one source makes a really important observation. It notes that presidents, any president, often struggle to implement their agendas in low-capacity agencies, regardless of their direct control.
Meaning the bureaucracy can be a bottleneck.
Exactly. Effective governance requires both control, the power to direct, and capacity, the institutional ability to actually execute. They're complements, not substitutes.
So a leader's strong will isn't enough.
Not on its own, no. Especially if driven by personal ambition. It has to be coupled with the administrative machinery, the expert personnel, the institutional capacity to translate that will into coherent, effective national policy.
And when that capacity is lacking, or the leader's focus is fragmented,
You can create huge challenges: confusion among allies, missed signals, inconsistent policy, and opportunities for adversaries to exploit the gaps. Which prompts that fundamental question again: what happens when personal ego, unpredictable behavior really drives high-stakes international relations?
yeah, what are the risks?
The implication from the collected sources seems clear. Leaders with those tendencies, unpredictable or maybe self-serving, can inadvertently end up gambling with global security for personal ego or perceived political gain.
Creates massive instability.
Immense instability makes it incredibly difficult for allies and even adversaries to predict actions, build reliable deterrence. It just increases the risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation all around.
And speaking of justifications for conflict, what about ethics? Things like just war theory.
Right. That long-standing ethical framework is very clear on one thing. Waging war simply to defend a leader's personal honor after an insult, or for purely personal interests rather than a legitimate collective cause, that's rejected. It's not a just cause for war.
But does that stop leaders?
Well, what's chilling, and highlighted in our sources, is the observation that false flag operations.
Contrived incidents to create a pretext for war.
Exactly. Contrived theatrical stunts or even actual staged attacks designed purely to create a justification for war. The observation is that these tend to be quite common, historically, unfortunately.
That's deeply cynical.
It underscores the inherent risk of manufactured justifications for conflict, often driven, as the source put it, by political rather than moral interests.
And when that's coupled with unchecked personal ambition,
It represents a profound ethical failing in statecraft. It further destabilizes global security, makes it harder to tell real threats from manufactured ones, and just erodes trust between nations completely.
wow. Okay, today we have taken a truly deep dive into these incredibly complex, interconnected currents that are reshaping global power. It's a lot to absorb.
It really is.
We've seen how specific actions like that Iran-Israel conflict, they revealed unexpected shifts in military capabilities, didn't they? And critically challenged that whole idea of escalatory dominance, fundamentally altering the strategic math.
Yeah, the assumptions are being tested.
We examined the profound strains on Western alliances, particularly NATO, under unique pressures from figures like Trump. And we observed the determined, often reactive adaptation of rivals like Russia and China. They're learning, they're changing.
They're not standing still.
Definitely not. And we've touched on that profound, sometimes really unpredictable influence of individual leadership, of personality, on these high-stakes global dynamics, revealing how personal ambition can inadvertently expose systemic weaknesses in the very structures of power.
It all connects: the personal, the political, the military, the industrial. It's all intertwined.
So where does this leave us?
Well, it raises an important, maybe even unsettling question for all of us, for you to consider. In a world where adversaries are demonstrably catching up, where they're actively learning from observed Western failures, and where the lines between political rhetoric and military action are getting increasingly blurred by individual ambition, how do nations actually build long-term predictability? How do they build genuine strategic advantage when a traditional military superiority just isn't a given anymore?
A fundamental challenge.
What stands out to you when you think about the implications of this? A global landscape where established dominance is constantly being challenged, constantly being redefined, and where the stakes for miscalculation honestly have never felt higher.